Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming at the busy time of the semester. My name is Yifan Gao, core faculty in the School of Landscape Architecture and the curator of exhibitions at Boston Architectural College. This evening's lecture, part of our Just Narratives series at the Boston Architectural College, reflect the BAC's commitment to advancing social equity through practice-based design education. We're honored to welcome our guest speaker, Dana McKinney White. I've been following Dana's work since shortly after we graduated from grad school and had the opportunity to get to know her work more deeply this past summer at Demerton Oaks. It feels especially meaningful to have her as a closing voice for this lecture series. Her work invites us to consider how design can be grounded in responsibility, accountability, and care, particularly when working with communities whose voices have too often been marginalized. Through approaches that combine data-driven research, sustained community engagement, and empathy, she asks how design processes might become more inclusive, not only in outcome, but also in authorship. Her work also challenges us to confront the more difficult terrains of practices, examining how design of systems and places can shape lived experience, and how designers might respond with greater awareness and care. Dana is a licensed landscape architect and urban planner and is an outspoken advocate for social justice and equity through design. She contextualized people and their broader communities through her work. Her academic and professional work integrate wellness, progressive public policy, and inclusive economics into innovative design solutions. Dana is assistant professor of urban design at Harvard Graduate School of Design. She's also the co-founder of Enfold Collective, an interdisciplinary architecture, planning, and design practice, which positions community voices at the center of its practice, and the co-founder of Studio Kin, a consulting practice advising on design and planning practices through a heightened commitment to vulnerable communities. Dana graduated from Princeton University with a BA in architecture and completed her master in architecture and master urban planning, both with distinction at the GSD. Dana is a co-founder of the Black in Design Conference at the GSD. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dana McKinney White.
Hello, everyone, and to those who are joining us online. As Yifan said, my name is Dana. You can just call me Dana for now. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my practice, my research, and a little bit about my life to some degree. I am going to just offer one quick warning that sometimes I use imagery that can be triggering. It is not my intention to re-traumatize or offer these triggers, but just as an acknowledgement that there are some really significant sensitivities of the work that I engage. I'm going to start with this picture, a little bit about me. I'm not in this picture, but the woman who's sitting all the way on the right is my mother, who is one of four children, 3 girls and a boy, growing up in Newark, New Jersey. Newark, which is known as the Brick City, is a sort of a twin city to Manhattan historically. However, today, as a result of sort of historic disinvestment and a number of other sort of social infrastructural issues, the city has kind of fallen in the backdrop of the region. As a consequence of a lot of its disinvestment, if you were to roll around the city, you would see scenes like this. This is a commercial building that's been boarded up, re-windowed somehow, used as a sort of a community board. There's a significance of blight and which homes have been burned down and graffitied onto. And you see the disinvestment even through the ongoing commercial activity throughout the city, where you see a lot of chicken shops, hairdressers, barber shops, but not a lot of real economic growth or investment that takes place more broadly. And while I myself was raised in a pretty small town, think of Gilmore Girls in Connecticut, this particular city has always been at the backdrop of my mind as I have negotiated and navigated the world of design in the built environment. And one of the things that has been most difficult for me to reconcile is this idea of how Newark has a 1 in 4 lifetime likelihood of incarceration. It is not, there are many other places in this country that have statistics like this, where outcomes of lived experience are very much tied to the experience that people have living and occupying these cities. And my mom's family is an anomaly. Not a single one of them has ever been incarcerated. But if you looked at any of the neighbors that live across the street, that live next door, around the corner, almost every single one of them has a family member who has since been incarcerated. And so when I was a student myself, I finished my time at the GSD, basically creating a love letter back to the city and thinking about this incidence of incarceration and systemic injustice. I created a project that was thinking a lot about the building environment, ways in which we can create wraparound services, housing, economic and educational opportunities. And this for me was really sort of one, the love letter to the city that I grew up around and near, but also as sort of the platform for which my career would since be built from. You might be able to find me in this picture. This is my graduating architecture class. I'm sitting in the front row, and I'm the only person of color, or at least, excuse me, the only Black person in this picture. And so it is really interesting for me to be in a practice of the built environment and surrounded by people who didn't look like me and trying to find ways in which I could give back to my community when I wasn't learning from or about these places that had really deep systemic issues. And like many of my classmates, I went across the country and some people went across the world to places to practice architecture, planning, urban design. I moved to Los Angeles. I had a really bad winter in 2015, and I was like, never again. So I moved to Los Angeles. And there I went to go work for Frank Gehry's office, Gehry Partners. And during my time at Gary, I worked on a lot of projects that had pretty significant budgets. Think of like hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, occasionally billion-dollar projects. And these were projects that had a lot of sort of civic and institutional impact on the world. This is the LVATP building, which is a Louis Vuitton Foundation building that sits next to the Louis Vuitton Museum, and it's focusing on arts and sort of creative spaces as an extension of the museum. I worked on the project called the Southeast Los Angeles Cultural Center, which is a series of pavilions that offer performance art and media art spaces within the county. I also worked on the Los Angeles River Master Plan for about 4.5 years and a bunch of other projects that came off the plan, such as this, which is called the Rio Hondo Confluence Area Project, really catchy, or the RECAP, where we were looking, excuse me, where we were looking at opportunities to activate the Los Angeles River, thinking about sort of social infrastructures as they coincided with ecological benefit. And as I'm working with these projects, these very, again, often billion-dollar investments, there were a lot of things that were bothering me about my own occupation of Los Angeles and some of the places that I was working within. And so conversations of homelessness became extremely prevalent, especially for those that were in relationship to the Los Angeles River. This is a scene of an area on the LA River where someone's living in a conduit to the river. And every year, some unhoused person unfortunately passes away as they get washed into the river during a stormwater event. And so this kind of went back to the social sort of impetus for me to be in the built environment space. And as I was occupying LA and working on projects, I continue to see patterns of haves and have-nots. This is a project that's focusing on systems of homelessness by Brooke Scarpa. It was for Skid Row Housing Trust, and it was really a project dedicated to housing unhoused veterans who needed wraparound services. And it's this really beautiful intervention amongst sort of a depressed scene of Skid Row. But still, you see an increased presence of homelessness. Across the United States, they had the highest incidence of homelessness on record this past year, and it's only seeing a growing trend. And so, yes, we as designers can build these interventions, but the trends around us are continuing to grow larger beyond us. Within the space of education, this was a project I worked on a long time ago with William Ramos Associates just down the street at the Windsor School. And it's, these beautiful spaces where people, mostly these are all women and children, who have access to beautiful spaces of education. But in Newark, this was a school that wasn't too far away from my grandparents' house, the Samuel L. Berliner School. It's an elementary school that's made out of modular buildings and surrounded by chain link fences. And I don't know, if I was a 5-year-old walking to school, to this school every day, I don't think I would be particularly inspired to learn. And housing solutions that we're seeing across the country, we see the sort of investiture in housing that is really nice, that has an affordability mix like this along the Atlanta Beltline. But then there's still this overwhelming prevalence of cruciform brick buildings that makes up America's public housing stock. And my sort of thesis as I'm looking around and I'm observing and I'm talking to people and I'm engaging in my own practice is that the built environment is laced with implicit bias. If anyone's ever seen the Broadway show Avenue Q, there's a line, everyone's a little bit racist. And I'm going to say this, everyone's a little bit racist. We all have foundational beliefs that some people are deserving, whereas others are not. And I would highly recommend, if you haven't already, to take one of these implicit bias tests that Harvard University invented a few years ago, which basically tries to determine how far your implicit biases lay, whether that be against people of color, people who have disabilities, elderly, people with different weight differences. And what you will see is that no matter how progressive you may feel like you are, there's going to be some bias that you have inlaid within you. And as designers of the built environment, these biases get codified in the designs that we build on a day-to-day basis. And so my sort of challenge to you all, to my students, to others that I talk to and I engage with, is how do we challenge those biases and really think more progressively about designing more equitably and more just? And so my realization is that design has truly failed to protect the health, safety, and well-being of all communities. And in fact, we've actually caused harm to those who are most vulnerable among us. So when I think about vulnerabilities, a lot of my work is at the intersection of communities of color, thinking about aging and disabled populations, system impacted by the criminal legal system, people experiencing homelessness, immigrants and refugees, as well as veterans. But I try not to look at these groups as individual sort of identifiers, but instead thinking about the intersectionalities across them. And they are very often quite prevalent of intersectionalities. And then within my day-to-day life, I operate within 3 spaces, that of design, research, and teaching. I'm not going to get into my teaching today, but my design and my research are basically intertwined and they feed one another. And so as I'm working as a designer and a researcher, I'm really trying to think of ways in which we can repair past harms by thinking much more aggressively and through a just lens, through a just lens of how we can address current issues, as well as starting to think and project towards the future. And so I've kind of come up with this term of community informed, and I'll go through it shortly, but community informed blank. And we're sitting here among landscape architects, urban planners, designers in general, and fill in the blank. And so for me, this approach is looking at a 3-part method. It's engagement, working with communities, co-designing, standing in conversation, listening, not just responding, but listening. A data-driven research approach in which you're looking at GIS mappings and surveys and census data and public health metrics. And then lastly, using a lens of empathy. This last one is something that I think came to me because even in the space of sort of community engagement work, time and time again, you see people who engage community members, and at the end of the day, they kind of go home and still kind of think of that person as lesser than. And so I think as we engage, we have to think about how we can do so empathetically, but also, and I'm going to say this word, and sometimes people giggle, but like with a lens of love. And I don't think we talk enough about our emotional relationships to projects and the communities that we work with, but we really need to have a love and a foundational respect for these individuals. So moving on to a few projects. I'm going to start with one that was particularly important in my career so far. It's a public art piece called Black Still, and it was located in Los Angeles, California. at the M&A and Craft Contemporary Courtyard. This project came out of a series of conversations, but was really something that grew out of the pandemic. And I'll show you the location here. This particular courtyard is trying to do something, a model very similar as MoMA PS1, in which they had this sort of residual courtyard space next to the museum. It's on Miracle Mile, right across the street from the LA, from LACMA, the LA County Museum of Art, as well as a few other really significant cultural institutions. And so trying to figure out ways to bring art into a more public environment and very close to the street. And so as my business partner and I get to the site, we were both like, what the heck is going on here? There's like this random white tent and these like really cheap folding tables. And then there's like random picnic table that looks like it belongs in someone's backyard. And then steel columns that are coming out of the middle of the floor. And then even worse, there's this black sticky stuff coming out of the ground, which you'd step in and then your shoe would get stuck to. That black sticky stuff is tar. And what's really interesting about this site is that it sits at a ground in which you have naturally occurring tar pits, you know, hundreds of thousands of years old, tar that literally starts to come out of the ground, especially during hotter days of the year. The tar is sticky. It's this deep, dark black that has sort of like a glossiness to it. It's a little smelly. There's methane gas. And you can see it more directly being daylit. This is the courtyard over here, right across the street at the La Brea tar pits, where you actually see it bubbling out of these little water bodies. At the same time, when we were invited to do this project, again, it was the kind of the height of the pandemic. This was around early 2021 when we first got the invitation. We felt very isolated. Both my business partner and I are Black women. And on top of the experience of the pandemic, we also were feeling the sort of the weight of the world relative to Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd. And we ourselves are not even able to meet in person. We're not able to have a traditional community engagement process. We're not able to engage the museum and the stakeholders the way we normally would like to. And at the end of the day, I think in conversation with people, just informally started talking about how can we create spaces of healing, especially given the weight of the world around us. And we were inspired by the black tar that we kept on stepping on. And we wanted to find ways in which we could subvert sort of the negative connotations of Blackness, especially given the news of what was going on in the world. And so we started to reframe the notion of Blackness as a place as a color of contemplation, as something that's good, as soothing, as spiritual, absorptive, special, affirmative, and healing. And we very quickly changed the language we used around color accordingly. And because of the pandemic, we started to do a series of online engagement, including with members of the museum board, a nonprofit that was a local arts organization. And we would do these sort of co-designed mirror board Zoom exercises. This was early pandemic, so like Zoom wasn't, we were still kind of figuring our stuff out, but we would do these mirror board exercises and basically try to co-design with individuals that would be really interested in the project. We also hosted a number of focus groups with healing practitioners and wellness practitioners in the area, people who do Reiki and yoga and other sorts of healing body practices, because we were interested in actually inviting them into the space later on. So we came up with this initial idea of a volume that somehow would have a rainbow off the top of it. We'll see how we get there, but a black volume that would kind of center and focus this sort of disaggregated, confused courtyard space. And through those conversations, we started to have greater conversations regarding materiality, like what should this object be made of? We came to the idea of a lath and plaster building. And lath and plaster, this is what you're seeing here is actually what would typically be hidden behind a wall, but we wanted to subvert that expression and have the plaster oozing out. And the idea behind this was that the building itself was like absorbing and then putting something back out into the world. When we made this image, we're like, I have no idea how we're going to do this, but we'll figure it out when we get on site. But that was the inspiration. And then that rainbow, which we just couldn't get rid of, we wanted to have this aperture to the sky as a way to sort of focus the attention that we had once you were in the space. And somehow that rainbow would come above. One of the things that was really important was an idea of sort of maintaining a calm or almost a sense of sanctuary within the space. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about the interior materiality and how we could thicken the walls to try to sound dampen as much as possible. And so we ended up working with a hemp company that basically makes insulation made out of hemp to help with the sound dampening quality of the space. And as we were kind of co-designing with the museum, with some of our local stakeholders, with these wellness practitioners, we also wanted to be very intentional about the design of the making and the craft of this thing altogether. I'm not sure if you could tell, but I'm not the tallest person in the world. I'm about 5'2"-ish. And my business partner is a little taller than I am, but we weren't going to be able to manage very large pieces of lumber on our own. And so we wanted to find a contractor to help us build the root structure. We wanted to be intentional that the project would be for us and by us. And so we found a Black female-owned construction company in Los Angeles that was also upstarting. That's Bianca. Her son, I'm not sure if anyone notices this kid right here. Anyone know who that is? Um, Maybe not. That's Roddy Rich. Her son's Roddy Rich, which is just like a really funny side story. Like he showed up in a black Lamborghini on site. We're like, who is that? And I didn't know who he was. And my business partner was like, that's Roddy Rich. I'm like, oh, I don't know who that is. But yeah, so we had a really great time identifying and working with her and kind of trying to figure out ways for which she can build her own capacity. And then we decided to offer community build days once the stud walls were done. And we basically had to install roughly 3,000 pieces of wood lath. And we invited members of the community that we had engaged with previously online to come in person and install lath as a meditation. We also offered tours of the installation as they were during basically moments of breaks where we'd have members of the community we had engaged with come in and we would talk about the history and the legacy of wood lath construction specifically within Black domestic spaces. And then we were able to kind of figure out the plaster work. However, plaster would have melted if it rained, and so we ended up using a concrete mix and literally had to create this oozing sensation from the inside out over a series of days. And like a lot of projects, things go wrong or things happen that you may not have been able to anticipate. And one of our unexpected hiccups was that we didn't quite recognize the presence of homelessness right around the site. We ended up making friends with Mayor Mike, as he liked to call himself, who is kind of the mayor of the block, and then Miss Patty, who lived in this blue tent in front of the museum the first week, and then she moved her encampment to the backyard afterwards. And on several occasions, Miss Patty's tent would have bags of concrete or tools in them. And it was a really interesting sort of humbling moment as someone who cares deeply about unhoused populations to talk to an unhoused person and say, I really need that tool back, Miss Patty, and trying to basically engage with her as we were trying to finish this building project. So this was the final installation, which I think looks pretty much like the render. Final, just okay. And what it looked like from the outside. And as you moved inside of it, what you'll see is a different mix of materiality, one of which is using a black geotextile. And the idea behind that was that we would actually start to offer people another form of meditation in which they would take a black strip or ribbon and hang it on the wall of the installation. And so when you would come into the space, you could have your conversation, but you would meditate as part of your interaction and engagement with it. And as you can see on the top of the aperture, there's mist that was installed as a way to help cool the space because it is really hot sometimes in Los Angeles. And what it did do, thankfully, was create a double spectral rainbow pattern around you. It wasn't in the sky, but it would literally hit around your waistline and it would only hit around you individually. And so it was this really fun moment when we had people come into the space for the first time and they'd be like, oh my gosh, there's a rainbow around me. And you only saw your own rainbow and no one else's. And so there was this really interesting sort of phenomena that happened that we didn't quite anticipate. We worked with community groups to come in and program the space. So we had yoga classes and workshops. We had larger events outside of the space, including a tea ceremony. We had a Black wellness group come in. We also offered a space for crafts people to come in and sell their goods. And then we even held an event that was not something we had planned for. I'm going to toggle over. And basically, what started to happen within the community was that the word had gotten out that this space existed. And so musicians and ambient music artists asked if they could rent the space. The museum at the time was kind of like, okay, let's slow it down. But after a series of meetings and sort of facilitating those introductions, they very quickly got on board with this particular event. It was actually the most attended event that we hosted. About 150 people came through that day. And it was a really beautiful expression of, it's sort of an organic expression of how people can use a space and make it their own. And so this was the last day of the installation. So this is about 4.5 months in. And by the time we got there, the space had changed a little bit. It got a little bit fuzzier, and you started to see the impressions of hundreds, if not thousands, of people who came through its walls. And I think it was a really beautiful expression of just like when you listen and you co-design, how you're able to create something that becomes of the place that are inserting yourself in. This goes to another project. It's a bit of like a disc switch. This is Compton's Heritage House. And this really came out of a lot of the conversations we held with our contractor team, P31, as well as the city of Compton. Bianca was a city of Compton resident. She grew up there, had a very significant love for the city, and really wanted to start to figure out ways in which she can expand her own company's profile within the city. And during that time, the city had offered an RFP for what they call its Heritage House. It was the city's oldest residential structure built in 1869 from the good settlers of Compton, but it had completely fallen into disrepair. And so we, as a firm, went in with P31 Development to basically offer a new form of historic preservation. We spent a lot of time documenting sort of the disrepair of the building, in which there were issues with the roof, the porch was collapsing upon itself, issues with windows being non-functional. You can see some of the significant damage over here as well. And as part of the process of not only just restoring it, we said we want to do a few things. We want to do some research. We want to understand this house. Your records, they're okay, they're not great, but we want to understand how you as a city can better integrate this home into sort of the imagination of what Compton is today. And so we looked at sort of historic sandboard maps, which look at considerations of fire risk. We talked about the relationship of this particular building relative to the Watts riots and sort of the rejection of the house and the sort of the subsequent disrepair it fell in. We also looked at the house and sort of the population of what settler colonial Compton looked like as opposed to the current demographic of the city. And then we ran a series of semi-structured interviews with a number of nonprofits, as well as advocates, an author who is a historian on Compton's history, to basically understand, well, how does this home, which doesn't exactly speak to the current constituency of the city, how does this home move forward as something that this entire city can buy into? We also launched a social media campaign to basically think about how the home could represent the new Compton. So, I mean, it's a house. It looks better. We repainted it, we rebuilt the roof, we fixed the porch. We had to replace some doors and worked with like historic door retailers. But I think what was more important about it was that we kind of restitched this facility back into the rest of the city. Moving to another project, this is a research project called Kites. And I'm going to just start off by saying, as a sort of level setting, this is really focusing on justice involved individuals. And it also stems from the work of Black Still. Justice involved individual is someone who themselves has been directly incarcerated in jail or prison, or has been sentenced to community supervision, which is both probation and parole. It also includes youth who are in juvenile detention in the foster care system, as well as immigrant detention. And the reason why this particular research project came out was because one of the events we held at Black Still was with a nonprofit organization called A New Way of Life. They do reentry work with women who are formerly incarcerated. And as one of their sort of outreach efforts, they do these things called living libraries, where they have women who have since reentered give back to the community and tell their story of how they became incarcerated and their journey out since. And so we had a series of living libraries where we had people come in telling their story. Guests would come and sit down, could ask questions, and really try to understand and empathize with what the conditions of incarceration look like. And during one of the conversations, I was sitting next to this gentleman who was folding up and kind of fiddling with some of the ribbons. And at the end of the event, I said, well, what are you making? And they said, I'm making a kite. And I was like, well, can you explain a little bit more why you would be making a kite? Like most people just kind of add their strip and call it a day. And he said that when he was incarcerated in a women's facility in California, he was incarcerated in the SHU, or solitary confinement, because of their gender identity. And being in solitary confinement for basically 2 years, kites were the only way that they had an ability to reach the outside world. And so, a little bit of information as to what a kite is. A kite is a message that is basically written on a piece of paper, folded up really small, and then they call it fishing. Basically, you use a string that you might take from a bed sheet or a towel, and you fish it underneath the door, and you pass it from one cell to the next. And so this basically launched sort of an inquiry into this idea and practice of kites, in which you have people maintaining communication and contact with one another despite the conditions of their confinement, in which it's not just within the community that they're in, but within the broader community at large. And so this was one that someone shared with me. Their name was Shy, an example of a kite that they had set to a cousin who was on the outside. This led to some research related to the sort of the idea of the intensification and the fortification of the prison itself, studying how these have become so intensified environments, like Auburn Prison in New York. The ways in which we have tried to systemically eradicate communication between residents of facilities by the orientation of cells away from one another, from the single occupation rooms. And then looking at how other people have used kites historically, and it's not just used within the context of incarceration, but within a lot of prisons and jails across America, people use the toilet system if they don't have access to doorways with a large enough gap. They might use loose materials in the walls. There's a number of different ways in which kites can be sent from one person to the next. And just a quote from this, or there's a chapter in a book. Compact, ephemeral, intimate, and handcrafted, kites defy the otherwise rigid and highly securitized environments of carceral facilities. Contemporary jails, prisons, and detention centers are hard, acoustically reflective environments where voices and sounds are amplified and blurred by the overwhelming presence of steel, concrete, masonry block, poured concrete, and hard plastics. And kites serve as artifacts of relief, humanity, and normalcy in these highly engineered, artificial, and sparingly utilitarian environments. And you might be wondering, like, why is this girl like researching prisons in this regard? Again, I think it goes back to the root of how we have dehumanized and worsened people's lived outcomes. And so trying to really understand that through some of the most extreme architectural spaces. My final research project I'm going to share with you all today is a project that I'm currently working on. It's a book called Carceral Decay or Carceral Urbanism, depends on the day of the week, but and it's a book that is really looking more at the system of incarceration throughout America and its history and legacy. A lot of times when we think about mass incarceration, we talk about it from the lens of public policy or law, sometimes in the space of education and the pipeline, school to prison pipeline, excuse me. But I don't think the conversation has really re-entered the space of architecture or design more broadly as it should be. So when you track the incidence of mass incarceration over time, you see that there is a significant amplification of who has been incarcerated and just sort of the overall numbers and the scale of the condition as a result of three major policies: the war on crime, the war on drugs, and the Sentencing Reform Act. And what has happened was at its peak, roughly 2.1 million people were incarcerated in any given day of the week between state prisons, federal prisons, and local jails. But again, the peak, which took place somewhere time between 2017, 2018, we started to see a decline in this population. There's been a significant interest in investiture of closing facilities, specifically juvenile facilities. If you read almost any of the academic literature, almost no good outcome comes out of incarcerating a child. And at the same time, we're starting to see significant issues of deferred maintenance within our local and state and federal facilities. So just within the 123 federal prisons themselves, there's roughly $2 billion of deferred maintenance. This is starting to enter the national conversation in a few places. As pictured here, this is Rikers Island in New York City, which is one of the largest jails in the country, hosting over 21,000 people on a given day of the week. Rikers is considered the worst of the worst. Has the highest rates of human rights infringements, the highest incidence of violence, some of the highest incidents of manslaughter and murder within the walls of Rikers. And the city of New York has basically said that they need to close it because of all these injustices. As a consequence, the city's response, after many, many, many consultant dollars were spent, has been to build 4 new jails. 4 borough-based jails. There's 5 boroughs. Staten Island doesn't get one. Each of these new jails has roughly 900 beds and is at the cost of $1.5 billion per building, 4 of them. 2 of them are currently under construction and are set to open shortly. On the other coast, Men's Central Jail, located in Los Angeles, is the second worst offending jail in the country. This jail is much smaller. It has roughly 6,000 residents on a day-to-day basis, and it is another space that is overcrowded and has very atrocious outcomes. But what happened in Los Angeles that differed is while it was planning its roughly $2 billion new facility, the city of Los Angeles uprised against this. And so Los Angeles County canceled the contract for the new facility. However, you can't just close a facility. What happens to the 6,000 people who once lived there? And so literally days before the pandemic, the county released a report called CARE's First, Jail's Last Motion, which looked at hundreds of alternatives to incarceration that would look at wraparound services, public and affordable housing, subacute and acute housing, and other sorts of activities to support the roughly 6,000 people that would be decarcerated from that facility. And all of this, there's a question of like, what is the real impact of incarceration? I like to think of it as a revolving door, at least in this country. Almost 80% of people recidivize or re-enter prisons and jail within 5 years of their release. As compared to places like Norway or Finland at 20%, we have one of the highest rates of recidivism in the world. And for the recidivism, there's a number of reasons. Housing insecurity being one of the most often cited reasons, substance abuse, employment insecurity, mental health, and family disconnection. At least one of these things is explicitly spatial.
And I also just think that we can't think about incarceration and sort of the criminal legal system more broadly without thinking about how it's actually imprinted itself within America's fabric. So this is an example of a juvenile detention hall in California that is surrounded by a dense suburban footprint. And so, as I'm working through this book, one of the things that I'm trying to understand is we're at a crossroads here. We have a number of facilities that are about to go online for major renovation projects or closure projects. What do we do from here? And how do we, as designers, insert ourselves into the conversation? One thing we can do is the status quo approach. We can continue to build bigger, build new, build more secure. This is the siting of a future federal prison in Lecter County, Kentucky, at the site of a mountaintop removal project at the former coal mining site for a federal prison and work camp, which I didn't know we were still in the business of building work camps. We can think about the reuse or the adaptive reuse of buildings. And so Liberty Crest Apartments is a building or a series of buildings in Fairfax County, Virginia, that has converted an old prison, into housing, offering sometimes like interesting spaces, you could say. But there's still sort of that stain. I mean, here in Boston, we have Liberty Hotel. A lot of times when developers work on these projects, Liberty becomes like the first word that becomes top of mind. There's also an effort to think about reform. And so reform can look like, well, what are other places doing that don't have the issues that we have? So Halden Prison, for example, in Norway, it's one of the most secure facilities in the world, has some of the lowest rates of recidivism. And on the right, this is a project that actually just got completed, so I should probably update it with new pictures. But Parrot Creek, which is a juvenile program that looks at housing and wraparound services within a really beautiful landscape and thinking more about land stewardship as a model of rehabilitation. There's also alternatives. And these alternatives don't necessarily have the same resonance within spatial design practice, but these alternatives can look like courts, whether they're specialized courts for kids who are being kind of diverted from the juvenile system, substance abuse courts, sex trafficking, a number of others. And then the most extreme version of what could happen next is abolition. Abolition for a lot of people is a bit of a dirty word, especially in the context of the criminal legal system. Like, how do you truly abolish prisons? How do you get rid of jails? But if you think about the history, these are new phenomena. America really didn't start building prisons until 1818. And so what could other models look like? What are other systems that we can rely on to think about true rehabilitation and not just sort of a perpetuation of a system that's not working? And I would be remiss to not talk about how there are other systems that have either benefited or hurt from systems of like similar to systems of incarceration. We have a bit of an exportation problem where countries, similar authoritarian leadership, are starting to follow the American model of incarceration. This is CCOT, which is now the world's largest prison with almost 40,000 residents in El Salvador, which now actually holds just under 300 Americans who are being detained from ICE. And then there's a translation problem and how we have basically used the model of incarceration in other issues related to immigrant detention, homelessness, substance use disorders, etc. But I don't want to end on a sad note. So I want to share a project that literally just opened this past weekend. It's another public art project in Austin, Texas. And Austin is known as the Violet Crown. It's a city that has these really beautiful sunsets, mostly because of air particulate matter, but they're beautiful. They go from these really bright yellows to purple. And so we were inspired by the sunset in part, and unfortunately did not have the breadth and the time nor the money to do a more comprehensive engagement strategy. But we wanted to think about how a public art piece can be responsive and almost create a form of engagement within itself. Um, we termed it sun clips based off of Buckminster Fuller's notion of sunsight and sun clips. Sunsight is for sunrise, sun clips for sunset. And it was an idea of how to think about reframing the centricity of the sunset or of the sunrise. And when we say sunrise or sunset, it's really this idea that like you or the world, the earth is the center of the universe. And so this notion of sun eclipsing is really that we are a bigger universe that is part of this larger phenomena. And so unfortunately, because of the lack of resources and time, we weren't able to do a full engagement process, but we did do some scraping, Facebook, Instagram, a little of other sorts of social media sites. And we tried to aggregate as many perceptions of the space as possible as of the city to try to understand how people relate to this notion of the sunset. We came up with a rough sketch that we sent to our clients, the city of Austin. And then we built it. And so this is pretty large, floating, colorful thing that sits above at the middle of Fleur Pedestrian Circle, which is this really robust interchange of pedestrians and cyclists. And it's suspended and is oriented due north within to kind of mimic the actual cardinal directionality of the sunset. And unlike our images, this thing does not stay still. It is like the most lively little creature, and you're just like, okay, like, is it gonna calm down? You're gonna see these beautiful strips? No, but it has this sort of dynamism that's constantly in motion. And so what it looks like from underneath. And I think one of the things about this project that has been really reaffirming is that even though we weren't able to have the time and the space and the energy to talk to people and to really listen to what they had to say about what art could look like in the space, it has been a convener of conversation. And so I was just there a few days ago where we sat there for hours and people continued to sit and talk and meditate and to create a sense of pause. And it has since become a very popular site within the city. I also would like to acknowledge that this project wasn't built in isolation. It's part of a broader exhibition of 9 projects built along the river, and of which 4 talk or think about this idea of the sun. And so we weren't alone in sort of thinking about this as a thematic, and have since had numerous conversations with the other exhibiting artists about the role of the sunset, the sun, and sort of this idea of a collectivism for the city. And I'm just going to end on a final quote, which is one that I try to hold in the back of my mind, and that I want to leave with you all today. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest ones. It's by Nelson Mandela. I just think that we should think more explicitly about how we can uplift the people that are, most, disadvantaged among us, how we can challenge our biases, and how we can listen better. Thank you. I guess we'll take questions. So there's chat. Should I check the chat? Okay.
One of my questions is, I actually have 2 questions, but I think I might just ask one. But how have your research projects transformed your values and beliefs?
I'm sorry, my body's what?
How did your research projects transform your values and beliefs?
Oh, I perhaps become more progressive with every project that I work on. And I didn't think I could get any further to the left than I am, but I just every time I just keep on crossing that boundary. I think my sense of empathy has only grown since. And like when I was working on Black Still and Miss Patty, I was so mad at Miss Patty. I was like, we have been feeding you all week. Like, and you learn that it just builds a level of humility. Um, and so I think it's a combination of like my own sort of self-growth, but I think it also gives me craving to work deeper and deeper within this space where people are just not being seen, not being heard, not being valued. They're not, people otherwise think they're not deserving of good design. And so I think it just continues to fuel that. If you have another question, I can answer it.
Do you have a place that you dream about, or not dream about? Do you have a place that you dream about making a research project on?
Hmm. That one requires some thought, and I want to do a research project on. I mean, I would really love, I mean, I'm not sure if it's more of design or more research, but I would like love to do like a focus group engagement with prison and jail abolitionist and then design the heck out of it. Um, the issue is within the context of the real world, no one wants to bet on something they don't know. And I would love to have the space and the time to truly design something that focuses on abolition, but then like talk to some of the people who have been at the forefront of the conversation for decades. And there are some like really powerful, well-spoken women, especially in that space, that I would love to just be able to like pick their brains and like co-design with them. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Which one? Oh, okay. Whoever rose their hand, do you want to speak? Oh, okay. Okay. Well, maybe the next person who walked up.
Thank you for a really great talk. In public health, we talk a lot about prevention versus treatment being the medical model and public health being the sort of prevention model. And I'm not quite sure where you're falling, like in that dichotomy, I'm not sure where you're falling. Are you falling in the idea that design can obviously be a treatment for some of these challenges, but are you also sort of suggesting that design is in fact preventative? And so I'm just curious more about how you see these things and what direction you feel like is the most promising, et cetera. Thanks.
That's a really great question. I mean, I think in the world of reality, we have to think about both ends of the spectrum. I think where you see money relative to projects and built interventions, it's really because of the way that this country is structured, it's going to be much more as a reactive measure or procedure. Where I would like to spend most of my time is on prevention. And what I have seen time and time again is because of the way that the bias or direct intentionality of harm has taken place within the built environment, it has caused or exacerbated certain social conditions. And so I feel like design can be used as like an inoculation to some of the underlying conditions that we have allowed to pervade historically. So ideally, it would really be on the front end and not as a reaction.
Hi. Your presentation was amazing. I thought that quote at the end was very, it resonated with me in a way where, like, circling back to the prison systems and looking at like the lowest citizens of our country, both the impoverished and also, ones that are incarcerated and going through, that process. And even your project before, I think it tied together really well. I guess my question is, like, and we see the prison system today, there's like levels to it, there's high security, low security of it. And I think it's really cool, yes, how the architecture kind of helps in that way. Like, I think treating prisons that way is really, I'm asking, how do you envision the development of more modernized prison systems, how the architecture can, help, those incarcerated? Not saying that, like, the worst of the worst criminals should, get sort of architectural treatment, but, to help those who are, having mental problems or, substance abuse, how the architecture can actually help. How do you envision that?
Yeah. Well, foundationally, I'm an abolitionist. So I don't believe we should have prisons. And when we talk about the worst of the worst, even, I think there's a value judgment associated with that. And I don't believe anyone should have to live in these facilities. I've been to many, many prisons and jails, both here in America and internationally. And time again, it looks like the space is punitive. It's intentionally harmful. And so I don't think anyone deserves to be in a space that's going to cause harm onto them or their bodies. I would also just note that I think we have to think a little bit about like our perceptions of what justice truly are. What does it mean to be just in society? How do we react to incidents of injustice? And I would like to say that I think we as a society need to think about justice as rehabilitation and not as retribution. It's not about punishment. Um, and so I think this kind of maybe goes back to the last question of like, I think some of the issues are we have created spatial environments, cities, housing, schools that are similarly punitive in the way that they've been designed. And so what do you expect when your home, your school, your places of learning, your places of worship are harmful? And so I think it's a bigger approach, a structural approach of looking at systemic changes in how we design, regardless of the condition or the constraints of a community might be facing. One of the things that you often talk about within sort of decarceration is what do you do with the people who have committed rape, murder, serial crimes? But if you look at their trajectories in their lives, and I think this is all the reason that I like to talk so much about my own life, is those people did not start there for the most part. Those people started off with much lower grade, often property offenses, not physical or bodily offenses, and it built up over time because of that revolving door. And so I think we have to like put a wrench into that door and stop it from accelerating altogether. And I think revaluing how we look at how people have been harmed by the spaces we've created for them. Yeah.
So I found out that the online people are somehow incapable of unmuting themselves. So
Oh.
I'm going to give Regin's
Okay.
question a voice. What are the methods of approaching communities to start the design and implementation process? And do you have academic methods? How can the community engage to their fullest potential?
Yeah. So I have a whole class, which I didn't talk about today, but I have a whole class about community engagement and how it can then translate into design. And I think you have to design your engagement method per the community you're working with and per the project you're working on. And so when I'm working on like a consulting project or even within my own design work, I kind of have a menu of options, but I realize that that's not the full gamut of what is available to me. I Some of the things that like I particularly like to rely quite heavily on are interviews, in which I use a semi-structured method, focus groups, community engagement, public events. A lot of times when people host public events, it's sort of this style that we're in right now. There's a presenter on the team and they're presenting the project and there's a Q&A after. I don't do that type of style of community engagement event. I only do science fair styles. And so I work with other members of the team, other people who know a lot about the project, and we spread out around the room and we have topical stations where people can approach you, engage in a one-on-one conversation. Social media, so a lot of usage of Facebook. I've done online engagement, doing targeted events based off of subpopulations within a community. So when I was working on the LA River Master Plan, doing events for Indigenous community members, doing events that were targeted towards adolescents, aging populations, kids between the ages of 5 to 10. And so it's really bespoke based off of the needs of the individual project. Also, budget is always a reality, and so some projects it feels like the world is like the options, you have all these options in the world. And other projects you just don't have that based off of what's available to you. So it really depends. Another question. It's fun. You can do it.
You spoke about how you see other like schools and other institutions, I don't know, community centers as punitive in a similar way that you notice in the prison system. Do you think that's intentional, or what elements do you specifically make it that way?
Yeah, I might make some enemies in saying this, but yes. Oh, absolutely. There are value judgments, and part of it is a budgetary constraint. So CMU, concrete block, is one of the most pervasive materials used in very low income housing, lower income communities that have schools, public municipal buildings. And you don't see that materiality in higher income communities. You just don't see it. When you look at the teams of designers who are designing prisons and jails and other justice facilities, they are often also doing similar types of construction methods as they are in schools and low-income housing developments. There are a lot of studies within communities that, and this is more from the criminal legal study, basically trying to calculate how many prison beds to build based off of the zip code and the number of children of a certain age. And so, as far as I'm concerned, you can't talk about prisons without looking at that front-end calculation. There are a lot of big three-letter architecture firms out there who will never advertise the amount of prisons that they've designed, but there's one that has designed almost 300 out of the nearly 6,000 in the country, or over 6,000 in the country. And so there is an understanding that I think is quite explicit, that there is a connection between the two, specifically in those communities that are most system impacted.
So I've done some reading with the author Glennon Doyle. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she's a philosopher, philanthropist and a writer. And one of the quotes that stuck with me is that when you start working, like she says, you start working with people and you're trying to help pull them out of a river, and eventually you actually end up looking upstream and seeing pushing the people that push them in. So do you ever see yourself working with legislation and taking a different approach to actually create some kind of guideline nationally or even on a smaller level that requires certain standards that are not what are currently in place?
Yeah, I see this a lot within some of the work on homelessness that I've engaged. And so when I was working on the LA River Master Plan, we were talking explicitly about incidents of homelessness along the river. The county itself has roughly 170,000 unhoused people. It's astronomical. The river has about 9,000 unhoused residents, 9,000 people just living in the river. And there is a lot of resistance of how do you design spaces that are beyond sort of traditional systems of homelessness, which are emergency shelters, permanent supportive, interim supportive housing. How do you build spaces that are not that still help to make their conditions better? And nationally, there has been a movement towards like safe lots, where parking lots have been converted into designated spaces for homeless encampments. And they will basically put toilets and mobile shower units. And that has been a lot of cities' reaction. Just put them on a parking lot, better than them being like in the environmental justice area. And so when I was on that team, that was the first reaction that the county had, which is build a new parking lot, put them on the parking lot, or use an existing parking lot rather. And they actually recommended using squishier surfaces. They're like, we can just like lay down a squishier pavement. I was like, that sounds horrible. And basically put my foot down and said, we're not specifying that as part of a 25-year master plan. We're not doing that. There are other solutions that are cheaper and much more humane. But it meant being able to present back to the client other options, which meant not looking at just what's happening in the United States and what our best practices are, because our best practices are crap as far as I'm concerned, but looking elsewhere in the world. And a lot of it falls within, unfortunately, for better or for worse, the Scandinavian context. And so thinking more explicitly about sites of sanitation, thinking much more creatively about how you can house people, like properly house them beyond emergency shelters. And so looking more towards hotel and motel conversions, other sorts of housing models. But when I'm working on a project, I personally feel morally obligated to the people who we're working for, and they often are not able to participate in the process. And so how do you bring voice to their needs? Because they're human just like the rest of us. And so I mean, for me, I just put my foot down, and if I can't come to a common ground, I don't want to be part of it. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, well, thank you. And thank you again to those who joined online.